I'm going to attempt to read the book Armed by Gary Kleck and Don Cates. According to the back jacket, Gary Kleck, one of the authors, is a professor at the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice of Florida State University. Don Cates is a partner at the national law firm of Benison and Cates. According to the back cover of the book, in a nation where nearly one half of all households have firearms, the gun control issue has never been more relevant. While some Americans support controls aimed at disarming only criminals and the irresponsible, others oppose any controls at all, seeing them as steps towards the confiscation of all firearms. Intelligent public debate on what types of controls, if any, are feasible requires some understanding of the results of the best research on guns and violence. In this thought-provoking study of the issue, researchers Gary Kleck and Don Cates closely examine the arguments used by advocates and opponents of gun control, identify crucially factual assumptions behind the arguments, and systematically address these assumptions using evidence from the best research available on the subject. Among the topics addressed are media bias in coverage of gun issues, prohibitionist measures for reducing gun violence, the frequency and effectiveness of the defense use of guns, and a close analysis of the Second Amendment. Easily understood by both specialists and laypersons, this engaging work will help the reader grasp many facets of this complex issue. This book is made by Prometheus Books. It is about 356 pages. There's some additional pages with like a bibliography, a subject index they call it. It is published in 2001 by Prometheus Books. It's Gary Kleck dedicated the book to Diane, Matt, and Tessa. Don Cates dedicates the book to E. Spector, P. Cates in memorandum, and C.B. Cates in propriety. If I thumb through the first couple of pages, the contents include an introduction along with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 chapters, a subject index, and a name index. The subject index looks like it's 4 or 5 pages, and then the name index is a couple as well. The introduction has quite a few parts. The introduction is by Don Cates. It looks like some of the chapters, each of the chapters is by one or the other of the two authors. So the introduction is by Don Cates. The first chapter, or the first section, I guess, is Guns and Public Health, Epidemic of Violence or Pandemic of Propaganda. That's also by Don Cates. The third section, Poisoning the Well for Gun Control, is also by Don Cates. Gary Kleck is the author of the fourth section, Absolutist Politics in a Moderate Package, Prohibitionist Intentions of the Gun Control Movement. Kleck is also the author, I guess, of Section 5, Modes of News Media Distortion of Gun Issues. Section 6 is the frequency of defensive gun use, evidence, and disinformation by Gary Kleck. The seventh section is the nature and effectiveness of owning, carrying, and using guns for self-protection by Gary Kleck. And then the last section is by Don Cates, and it's called The Second Amendment, a Right to Personal Self-Protection. Some of these sections seem to be longer than others. The book is about 56 pages. We'll dig in. Introduction. This book seeks to redress a remarkable dissonance that exists in the American gun control debate. On many issues, the conventional wisdom is substantially or even diametrically inconsistent with criminological, legal, and other scholarship. Contrast conventional wisdom as revealed in the editorials and columns of our leading newspapers and magazines to the following summary statements from the social scientific literature. Repudiating his own prior support for banning handguns, Professor Hans Toch of the School of Criminology, State University of New York, concludes that the best available current evidence shows that, and I guess this is a quote, when used for protection, firearms can seriously inhibit aggression and provide a psychological buffer against the fear of crime. Furthermore, the fact that national patterns show little violent crime where guns are most dense implies that guns do not elicit aggression in any meaningful way. Quite the contrary, these findings suggest that high saturations of guns in places or something correlated with that condition inhibit illegal aggression. An article analyzing violent crime patterns in Canada and the United States by Professor Brandon Sennerwalla of the School of Public Health, University of Washington, states the following. If you are surprised by my findings, and am I did not begin this research with any intent to exonerate handguns, but there it is, a negative finding to be sure, but a negative finding is nevertheless a positive contribution. It directs us where not to aim public health resources. From an article on urban youth violence by Dean Joseph Sedley of the School of Social Science, California State University in Sacramento, and his colleagues, we learn that, quote, the problem of urban youth violence will not yield to simplistic, usual solutions. In this connection, it is useful to point out that everything that leads to gun-related violence is already against the law. What is needed are not new and more stringent gun control laws, but rather a concerted effort to rebuild the social structure of inner cities. Substantially similar views are expressed by Dean Alfred Blumstein of the Heinz School of Public Policy and Management at Carnegie Mellon University. At a symposium presented of that paper, he added jocularly that banning guns or handguns to the general public is like trying to stop sexually transmitted diseases by forbidding sex. Our goal is to acquaint readers who do not regularly pursue scholarly journals with the findings therein that are so little reported in the major popular news sources. If we seem derisive about the controversial wisdom, it may be because both my co-author and I began working in this area under its influence. Laboring under that same misleading influence, lay readers are unlikely to know of the vast gap that exists between the conventional wisdom and modern scholarly findings. So let me begin with some glaring examples of how thoroughly modern scholarship has discredited the popular media's conventional wisdom about firearms regulation. Let me begin the second section. This is Armed by Gary Kleck and Don Cates. Introduction, Section 2. How often a small child is killed in a handgun accident? How often is a small child killed in a handgun accident? From the national publicity such deaths often receive, lay readers are likely to assume them to be as frequent as they are tragic. In fact, gun accidents kill only 10 to 20 children under age 5 each year. Tragic as each such death is, they are only about as numerous as the equally tragic deaths of children of that age who are poisoned by ingesting iron supplements that look like candy and are often prescribed for mothers after birth. Indeed, handgun accidents kill only about half as many children under age 5 annually as does the ingestion of common household poisons, roach spray, lighter fluid, ammonia, iron supplements, ant poison, and so forth. In fact, gun accidents rarely involve pre-adolescents of any age. See figures in Chapter 2. Typically, the wild exaggeration that regularly appears in USA Today's claim that 14,000 fatal gun accidents occur each year, the actual number is 1,400. In comparison, as many as 2.5 million victims use gun to defend against crime each year. See disclosures in evidence presented in Chapter 6. If the public is unaware of this, it is because the media did not mention the 2.5 million figure and report only a tiny proportion of such defense incidents. Nevertheless, the total number of defense uses is so large that the tiny proportion reported still can constitute a goodly number. Yet, consumers of the popular media are unlikely to realize how common such incidents are, because even when reported locally, defensive gun uses somehow never manage to make the national news, unlike far, far fewer instances of children being killed by gun accidents. The one exception is the defensive gun use that seems to have gone wrong, which can become national news. For example, when a Louisiana man mistakenly killed a Japanese student who menaced him at a Halloween prank, and when a Texan who received a concealed carry license under Texas new law of right to carry law killed a man who attacked him in a traffic dispute. In fact, both shooters were cleared, the Texan because he fired in a reasonable fear of death or great bodily harm from his larger and younger attacker. Those who get their information from the popular media are unlikely to realize that erroneous killings, which the Texas case was not, by civilians only total about 30 per year. Even less likely is the average person to know how favorably this compares to the police, who erroneously kill 5 to 11 times more innocent people each year. The non-reporting of successful victim self-defense incidents leads spurious credence to another argument that dates back to early in this century. Conventional wisdom holds that guns are not useful for self-defense. Defensive gun ownership is a dangerous self-delusion, and groups like Handgun Control Inc. advise victims who are attacked by a rapist, robber, or other felon that the best defense against injury is to put up no defense, give them what they want, or run. This conventional wisdom persists only because the definitive contrary facts receive little or no attention in the popular media. Criminology data and studies have definitively established that compared to victims who resisted with a gun, victims who submitted were injured about twice as often. Also, of course, non-resistors were often much more likely to be raped or robbed. Nonetheless, until quite recently, the sparsity of statistical information made it possible to still argue that guns are rarely used for self-defense. But a series of seminal studies by my co-author, Gary Kleck, have now demonstrated beyond peradventure that handguns are likely used by victims to repel crime far more often than they are by criminals in committing crimes, as much as 3 times more. I shall not review the evidence here, since Kleck does so in chapters 6 and 7. I raise the point only because this media contrasts strikingly with the remarkable accolade accorded by Gary Kleck and Mark Gert's study on defensive gun use by the doyen of American criminologists, University of Pennsylvania, Professor Mark Wolfgang, who wrote, I am as strong a gun control advocate as can be found among the criminologists in this country. If I had the power, I would eliminate all guns from the civilian population and maybe even from the police. I hate guns, ugly, nasty instruments designed to kill people. Nonetheless, the methodological soundness of the current Kleck and Gates study is clear. I cannot further debate it. The Kleck and Gertz study impresses me for the caution the authors exercise in the elaborate nuances they examine methodologically. I do not like their conclusions that having a gun can be useful, but I cannot fault their methodology. They have tried earnestly to meet all objections in advance and have done exceedingly well. I can only speculate as to why the popular media omits any mention of this tribute, even as they continue to ignore Kleck's work or treat it as doubtful. What can be said is that here again the popular media is suppressing scholarly research that contradicts conventional wisdom. It is interesting to consider how the popular media treated two studies coming to opposite conclusions about the effects of laws passed by 30 states to allow all qualified applicants to carry concealed handguns for self-defense. Though these laws had been embraced in many more urbanized states for 4-5 more years when it was done, the first study was limited to just 5 selected cities in Florida, Oregon, and Mississippi. In none of these cities had a murder been committed by a permit holder. Yet this small city-level study concluded that widespread carrying of concealed guns had not reduced crimes and perhaps even increased gun homicides in 3 of the 5 cities whose data were examined. These conclusions are a spurious artifact of the use of city-level data and the cities selected. Had the study looked at state-level data, even for just the 3 states selected, it would have found that overall homicide declined. It may have been coincidental that the study's conclusions here dovetail with the hypothesis its authors advanced elsewhere, that self-defense is not a personal right, but rather a social evil that ought to be eliminated to the extent possible. Yet the media gave this study extensive publicity. The New York Times actually reported it twice. Though the authors themselves qualified their results, neither their caveats nor their criticisms by other scholars have received attention in popular media reports of the study. Contrast the New York Times' total silence regarding a later study that differed from their earlier one both in its conclusions and its extensiveness of data. Done by University of Chicago economists, its findings were based on data from all 3,054 American counties. Perhaps more important to the Times, however, was that the data showed that liberal allowance of concealed carry by 31 states had coincided with a reduction of thousands of murders, rapes, and other violent crimes in these states. The authors tentatively concluded that the adoption of such policies by the other 19 states would save many more lives and prevent thousands of more violent crimes. Other popular media did not follow the New York Times in completely blacking out the University of Chicago study, but insofar as it was reported, the results were denigrated by falsely reporting the study having been sponsored by the gun industry. In turn, these falsehoods led to editorials denouncing the study as a fraud. Similar contracts are endless. For instance, to their credit, the New York Daily News and several other New York City papers have noted that the New York City Police, having unfettered discretion under New York law, issued concealed carry licenses only to especially influential people, including Donald Trump, numerous Rockefellers and DuPonts, and a raft of politicians, millionaires, and other celebrities. Perhaps because its own publisher was one of those licensees, the New York Times never found this story fit to print. It is ironic, to say the very least, that in lieu of such information, the New York Times give readers editorials asserting that the urban handgun offers no benefits. Because most civilians, whether their income level, are likely to lack the training and alertness required to use a gun to stop an armed criminal. Returning to the issue of accidental death, a child under age 15 is 351% more likely to drown at a home in an unattended swimming pool or bathtub than to be killed in a handgun accident. Editorialists often assert that no one really needs a handgun. It would be more accurate to say that no one, except the disabled, needs a bathtub as opposed to a shower, and that in most areas, even Olympic swimmers do not need a home swimming pool. Does it follow that home swimming pools and bathtubs should be subject to licensing system under which they are forbidden to all but the disabled and anyone else who can satisfy authorities that they have a pressing need that cannot otherwise be met? In raising this rhetorical question, I am aware that handguns and swimming pools are different things and may require different policy responses. A vital difference, for example, is that swimming pools do not prevent millions of violent crimes annually. The character of gun owners. The popular media's depiction of the character of 50% of the American populace who owns firearms provides another example of how far conventional wisdom differs from sociological fact. News columnists, cartoonists, and the media in general contemptuously dismiss such people as deluded, uneducated, intellectually and socially backward, and morally obtuse. To their credit, American news media do not normally air stereotypes, condemnations of entire groups. But to this there is one exception. As a class, gun owners are routinely reviled by the popular media as gun lunatics who silence the sounds of civilization, gun nuts, gun fetishists, traitors, enemies of their own Patriot, terrorists, anti-citizens, sexually warped bullet brains, Klansmen, thugs, and vigilantes who represent the worst instincts in American character, or in human character. Contrast the facts sociological and psychological research reveal about the character of gun owners as a class and summarized by Professor Kleck in studies sponsored by the National Institute of Justice. This is a quote, middle and upper income people are significantly more likely to own firearms than lower income people. Gun owners are not, as a group, psychologically abnormal, nor do attitude surveys show them to be, more racist, sexist, or violence-prone than non-gun owners. Gun ownership is higher among middle-aged people than in other age groups, presumably reflecting higher income levels, and a sheer accumulation of property over time. Married people are more likely to own guns than non-married people. Probably fewer than 2% of handguns and well under 1% of all guns will ever be involved in even a single violent crime. Thus, the problem of criminal gun violence is concentrated within a very small subset of gun owners. Goes on to quote, it is clear that only a very small fraction of privately owned firearms are ever involved in crime or unlawful violence, the vast bulk of them being owned and used more or less exclusively for sport and recreational purposes or for self-protection. It goes on, studies find gun owners do differ from non-gun owners in some ways. Gun owners are more likely to approve defensive force, i.e. force used to defend victims, in contrast with those with violent attitudes who condone violence against social deviants or dissenters are more likely to own guns than not. A study of citizens who rescued crime victims or arrested violent criminals found those good Samaritans were 2.5 times more likely to be gun owners than non-gun owners. In sum, the conventional wisdom about gun owners, perpetuated by their enemies, among which the popular media must be counted, is a bigoted stereotype that would be recognized and denounced as such if it were directed against gays, Jews, African Americans, or virtually any group other than gun owners. This bigotry is particularly hard to dispel because the generally good-hearted, progressive, liberal people who perpetuate it are wholly incapable of understanding that any opinion they fervently embrace could be bigotry. The myth that ordinary people murder. This brings me to a related character issue, the conventional wisdom that most murderers are perpetrated by ordinary people and only because they had firearms available in the moment of unforgivable or ungovernable anger. The endlessly repeated argument for banning firearms is that most murderers would be considered law-abiding citizens prior to their pulling the trigger. Most shootings are not committed by felons or mentally ill people, but acts of passion that are committed using a handgun that is owned for home protection. The point of these falsehoods is to evade the problem that gun bans being unenforceable. The embarrassing fact that criminals are not going to obey gun bans can be evaded by misrepresenting murder as something committed by non-law-abiding or by the law-abiding citizens. But the use of life-threatening violence in this country is, in fact, largely restricted to a criminal class and embedded in a general pattern of criminal behavior. This is documented by homicide studies so numerous and consistent that their findings have by now become criminological axioms about the basic characteristics of homicide. Local and national studies dating back to the 1890s show that in almost every case, murders are abhorrents, exhibiting life histories of violence and crime, psychopathology, substance abuse, and other dangerous behaviors. Looking only to prior criminal records, roughly 90% of adult murderers had adult records, and an average adult criminal career had over 6 or more years, including 4 major adult felony arrests. I emphasize adult murderers' records to distinguish the minimum 10% of murderers are minors. By definition, they can't have adult records, and state law has made juvenile crime records unavailable. But recent criminological studies at Harvard University have gained access to some of those records. They show the average minor who has murdered has compiled in less than 21 years of life at least 5 to 10 prior arrests. Between them, the relatively small number of very scary kids who are identified as murderers in Boston in the years 1990 to 94 had previously been charged with 3 murders, 160 armed violent crimes, 150 unarmed violent crimes, 71 firearms offenses, 8 involving other weapons, and hundreds of property offenses and drug offenses. The great majority of these murderers were gang members, though their murders were not necessarily gang-related. Example, a gang member beats a girlfriend to death, believing she has been unfaithful to him. In short, available evidence as to juveniles who murder shows them to be as aberrant as adult murderers. By the same token, if the juvenile records of adult murderers were reviewed, criminal careers, juvenile and adult together, would show much more than their average of 4 major adult felonies discussed above. Thus, the fact that most murders occur among acquaintances does not mean they arise out of neighborhood or family disputes among previously law-abiding people. The typical acquaintance homicide involves murderers between members of the same or rival gangs, or between drug dealers and their customers, or the murder of a woman by a brutal man who has savaged her on numerous prior occasions. And the oft-mentioned, by anti-gun advocates, fact that many murders occur in homes fails to belie this, since criminals have homes too. National data on acquaintance gun murders in homes shows the most common victim-offender relationship was where both parties knew one another because of prior illegal drug transactions. Local homicide studies show that 80% of homicides in Washington, D.C. are drug-related. 84% of 1990 homicide victims in Philadelphia had crime records or showed anti-mortem use of illegal substances. 71% of Los Angeles child and teenage drive-by shooting victims are documented members of street gangs. 71% of shooting victims in 1992 Charlotte, North Carolina had criminal records. Likewise, trauma centers find recurrent gun and knife wounds to be virtually a disease common to unemployed, uninsured lawbreakers, substance abusers, those with subpar intelligence, and those with major mental disorders, each several times more likely to commit a violent crime than ordinary citizens. In sum, the possession of firearms by the reasonable law-abiding citizenry is not a cause of murder. On the contrary, murders are committed by a relatively small number of very scary adherents. It is desirable to prohibit guns to such adherents as our laws already do, but it is unreasonable to think that any law can disarm such people. As a National Institute of Justice funded evaluation of the literature on criminology of firearms put it, this is a quote, "There is no good reason to suppose that people intent on arming themselves for criminal purposes would not be able to do so even if the general availability of firearms in the larger population were seriously restricted. Here it may be appropriate to recall the first law of economics, a law whose operation has been sharply in evidence in the case of prohibition of marijuana and other drugs, prostitution, pornography, and a host of other banned articles and substances, namely, that the demand creates its own supply. There is no evidence anywhere to show that reducing the availability of firearms in general likewise reduces their availability to persons with criminal intent, or that persons with criminal intent would not be able to arm themselves under any set of general restrictions on firearms." Each of these has footnotes, by the way, and there's 5 pages of notes with all the footnotes on just the introduction of this book alone. It goes on to say, likewise, an English gun control analyst has commented that no matter how restrictive and severe its laws, in any society there will always be enough guns available to arm those who are willing to obtain and use them illegally. Thus, conventional wisdom, as it is wrong in thinking that gun laws of any kind can substantially reduce crime, as it is in thinking that widespread gun ownership leads the law-abiding to murder. The next section is called A Threat of Long Gun Substitution. Indicative of the truly lamentable intellectual quality of the argument for banning handguns is that far more than 30 years it has rested on the correct premise that guns are more deadly than other methods of assault, from which it jumps to the conclusion that reducing the availability of handguns may reduce the number will reduce murder, even though so concluding concede that such reduction will not reduce the number of violent confrontations. The error lies in assuming that without handguns, attackers would substitute knives, weapons that kill only about 2.4% of those that they wound, where handguns kill 10 to 15%. Never examined is the possibility that at least some assailants might turn to rifles, weapons that are about 15 times more deadly than knives, and therefore 5 to 11 times more deadly than handguns or shotguns, which are so more deadlier that yet, for medical purposes, the wounds they cause ought not be compared with other bullet wounds. At close range, they're as deadly as a cannon. Criminologically, studies demonstrate that anywhere from 54% to about 80% of homicides occur in circumstances that would easily permit the use of a long gun. Professor Kleck modeled that what would happen if differing shares of prospective attackers who otherwise would have used handguns instead substituted long guns of differing lethalities. He showed that a net increase in homicide deaths as a result of long gun substitution was likely, and that the only way eliminating handguns would not increase homicides would be if there was some combination of unrealistic low levels of substitution of long guns, or substitution of unusually low lethality long guns, like long guns that were only twice as deadly as a handgun, for example, in combination with less than half the attackers substituting a handgun. How likely is it that criminal attackers were deprived of handguns would substitute long guns? Of the 2,000 incarcerated felons who were queried at the National Institute of Justice survey, 82% said if a criminal wants a handgun but can't get one, he can always saw off a long gun. 87% of inmates who often used handguns in crime felt that sawing off a long gun to make it concealable for carrying would be easy, with 89% of those who had often used shotguns agreed. Based on these responses, Professor Alan Lizotte of the School of Criminal Justice at Albany estimated that the murder rate would triple if handgun bans were actually effective enough to allow felons to substitute long guns at the rates indicated. Another National Institute Justice-sponsored analysis facetiously suggested, and I quote, "If someone intends to open fire on the authors of this study, our strong preference would be that they open fire with a handgun, and the junkier the handgun, the better. The possibility that even a fraction of the predators who now walk the streets armed with handguns in the force of a handgun ban would prowl with sawed-off shotguns instead causes one to tremble." Then we're on to the Second Amendment constitutional right to arms. This is the last section of the introduction. Conventional wisdom calls the Second Amendment to the Constitution a mere collective right that guarantees nothing to individuals. A typical assertion in the popular media is that of Leonard Larson, Scripps Howard News Service. Only gun nut simpletons, NRA propagandists, and tin horn members of Congress striving for careers at the public trough defend against gun controls on constitutional grounds. Unlike journalists, however, almost all the qualified historians and constitutional law scholars who have studied the subject concur that the Second Amendment establishes an individual right to bear arms, which is not dependent on joining something like the National Guard. Representing the overwhelming weight of authority, this view so demonstrates the scholarly literature that it is acknowledged as the standard model of the amendment, even by its opponents. Of law review articles in the 1990s, 42 endorsed the standard model view, only 6 dissented. Significantly, this overwhelming weight of authority is nonpartisan, though the 6 dissenters were authored by vehement opponents of gun ownership, mostly lawyers for anti-gun groups. The standard model is endorsed by law professors, many of whom would have never owned a gun and were surprised and dismayed by the conclusion, the evidence forced upon them, including the major figures in constitutional law who address the issue. Reviewing Leonard Levy's book, Origins of the Bill of Rights, Professor Lucas A. Powell, himself an ardent liberal Democrat with scant affection for guns, notes that all serious constitutional law scholarship over the past decade has shown the collective right position to be historically bogus. Nonetheless, I have urged in debate with the NRA, the amendment does not forbid gun control, as opposed to wholesale prohibition. Registration, licensing, and other regulations are permissible if, but only if, they do not unreasonably hinder the freedom of law-abiding, responsible adults to choose to acquire firearms. For example, a 1-day waiting period to check a gun buyer for criminal record is permissible. New York's 8-month waiting period is not. A 1939 U.S. Supreme Court case allowed a challenge to gun laws under the amendment by individuals who had no connection to a state militia, but held that it protects possession of only military and quality weapons. If so, the amendment covers high-quality handguns and other firearms, but not poor quality or gangsters-type weapons, Saturday Night Specials, switchblades, knives, blackjacks, and so on. 3 1990s cases implicitly reject claims that the right to bear arms applies only to state militias. The amendment's wording, bear arms, was analogized to the carrying of arms by ordinary people, and the court emphasized in its wording, right of the people, is used consistently throughout the Constitution to denote the rights of individuals. All right, that is page 25, and that's the end of the introduction. There are 5 pages of notes to the introduction. I didn't mention every time there was a footnote, and those go to this 5 pages of notes here. So the next section is Guns and Public Health. That'll be page 31, and that will be next.